All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And thanks for joining me for today's presentation. I'm going to cover a few housekeeping details before we go ahead and get started today. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. It does include Q&A. Now, some people submitted some questions prior to today's session. So those are the questions I'll be handling at the end of the session. You can submit questions via chat. I've got a colleague on the line who'll be picking those up as they come in. If for some reason we do have an outage during today's session, just wait for a minute and try to reconnect. You can do that a couple of different ways. You can either just refresh your screen, or you can go to the email that you received prior to today's session, use that link in that email, and you'll be brought back into the session. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our certification assistant experts, or if you have additional questions about CMMC itself, or really any of the Exostar solutions, you can reach out to us a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team, all one word, at exostar.com, or you can come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a question a form on every page there, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have that way as well. So let's go ahead and dive into today's session. So what I'm going to talk about first is really kind of just level set everybody on the current state of CMMC. Now, big news, right? The final rule was published in the Federal Registry today, so I'll cover that. We're then going to talk about what goes into building out your system security plan, because that's really the baseline of every CMMC assessment. We'll talk about how to do a self-assessment, how to grade yourself on that. Then we'll talk about how you can use Exostar's Certification Assistant to really automate that self-assessment. Allow you to centralize all the information about your system security plan, use Certification Assistant to score yourself during that assessment, collect all that evidence, provide really that central platform to manage your overall CMMC program. We'll then do a quick recap, and then as I mentioned, I'll answer those questions that were submitted prior. Now, if one of those questions you have is, will I receive a copy of the slides and/or will I receive a copy of the recording of today? Yes, the answer is the answer. So as a follow-up to today's session, we'll be sending out via email the slide deck itself, as well as a link to the recording of today's presentation. So with that, let's dive into the content. So as I mentioned, the latest on the CMMC ruling is that it really is here. So there were two things that were going into finalizing the CMMC requirements. One of those is the 32 CFR, and CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. That went into effect last year in December 16th of 2024. That's the rule that established the overall CMMC program. It gives the, if you will, all the references to it, the different information about it. So it establishes that program. It's what allowed folks to start scheduling those third-party assessments, as you know, starting last December. Now, the final piece of that is the actual acquisition rule. That's the 48 CFR. That was published in the Federal Registry today. We heard about it yesterday, right? The announcement went out yesterday that it was going to be published today, and it was published today. What that does is it means in 60 days, the acquisition rule will be in effect. And so references to the CMMC program, what requirements around assessments can start to appear in contractual language. Now, the major difference between CMMC and the other parts of federal acquisition regulations that were in place before is that with CMMC, there's now a requirement not only to comply with NIST 800-171 if you receive controlled unclassified information, because that rule's been in effect for a number of years. But with CMMC, now, if you receive controlled unclassified information, you're going to have to receive once every 3 years, a third-party assessment of your compliance with those NIST 800-171 controls. CMMC breaks this out into 3 levels. Level 1 means you're not receiving controlled unclassified information. So if you receive a contract that only requires level 1, it means you won't be receiving controlled unclassified information. And this is the majority of DoD contracts, right? 63% of organizations out there are only going to be at level 1. Level 1 has 15 requirements of how to secure federal contract information, or FCI. You'll have an annual self-assessment and an annual affirmation that you do those 15 requirements. Level 2 is where we start to get into the third-party assessments. Level 2 means you're going to be receiving controlled unclassified information as part of your requirements to fulfill that contract. And you need to protect that information in accordance with NIST 800-171. Once every 3 years, you'll be required to have a third party assess that you actually do control that information in accordance with NIST 800-171. Now, there are a small number of those contracts that will allow a self-assessment rather than this third-party assessment. That's less than 2% of these, and the contracting officer will be the one who gets to decide whether or not this contract will allow for a self-assessment. You don't get to request it. You don't get to ask for a waiver or anything like that. The contracting officer will do that at time of putting out the RFPs. And then a small number of contracts, less than 1%, will require a level 3 certification. Level 3 is more stringent. It not only includes those 110 controls from NIST 800-171, it has 24 additional controls from NIST 800-172. That will also require that every 3-year assessment, but that 3-year assessment is going to be done by DIBCAC, not by a C3PAO. Now, in 60 days, right, the CMMC implementation plan starts. The way the DoD has this currently laid out, it's a 4-phased approach to implementing of this CMMC program. So, right, begins at CFR effective dates, that's 60 days from today. That's when the rule should become effective. And it's going to kick off that phase 1. That's expected to be a 12-month period, where self-assessments will still be the rule of the day. After that first year, that's when you'll start to see these level 2 certifications start to be required contractually. And then in phase 3, after those first 2 years, is when you'll also start to see the level 3 certifications come into play. And then after that, when that 4th year kicks in, that's when you'll start to see a full implementation, including putting in requirements of existing contracts and things like that. Now, please keep in mind, this chart of the implementation plan, these timelines, I grabbed this straight from the DoD's website. I checked, it's still up there. It's still expected to be this kind of plan. However, please understand that blue bar that says in some procurements, DoD may implement CMMC requirements in advance of these planned phases. So on a per contract basis, if it is considered an important enough program, you may see a third-party assessment requirement prior to the phase period where you thought that might start. So I guess what I would say is just I'm encouraging everybody, right? We've heard a lot of cruft. We've heard a lot of misinformation about CMMC not being implemented, things like that, it is going to take into effect. Start planning for that third-party assessment if you are planning to bid on contracts that have controlled unclassified information. So with that, right, that's so CMMC coming into effect, but there are some requirements that you may have today if you have contracts with the Department of Defense, or if you have subcontracts to those that do have those contracts. As I mentioned, the requirement to safeguard controlled unclassified information in accordance with NIST 800-171 has actually been around for quite a while. You may have contracts today with DFARS clauses, as you see here, the 7012, 7019 clauses. Those require that you protect controlled unclassified information in accordance with NIST 800-171. That's the 7012 clause. And if you've got contracts with that 7019 clause, that clause requires you to do an annual self-assessment to score yourself on that self-assessment, and it provides references to an assessment guide, that's the 171 alpha that you see referenced here, that provides you a scoring system for each of the different controls. That scoring system, as you do your self-assessment, it allows you to compile that score. It's going to be somewhere between a -203 and 110 because each of the controls is weighted either with a value of 5, 3, or 1, or subsequently those negative values, hence the -203. And you'll compile a score, and you're supposed to enter that score into the Supplier Performance Risk System. That's the SPRS system. This is a DoD website. You should have registered for it, gotten a cage code for your organization, etc. You go into that system, and this is one of those things that you input, based on that self-assessment. This is one of the values that's put in your overall supplier performance risk score. Only the DoD has access to this. They're the only ones that see it. This is between you and the Department of Defense. All righty. So when we look to do our NIST 800-171 self-assessment, the thing that encompasses is what's called our system security plan. And in order to create that system security plan, we first need to decide what is our system. And so it is the system in which we store, process, or transmit that controlled unclassified information. So one way to start to define that system is to create a data flow diagram. And when you do that, and I would highly encourage everyone to do this, you're going to take a look at how controlled unclassified information enters your organization, who in your organization touches, manipulates, etc., that information, where they store it, where they manipulate it, all those kinds of things, and then how that information leaves your organization or your systems. Now, these could be electronic systems, but it could be physical systems as well, right? You may print out some of this information. You may then have to store that information, in file cabinets. You may have to use that information, manipulate it in CAD systems, etc. So all of those things should be part of your overall system security. And that definition of that system is where you start to demark and determine, okay, is my system going to be an enterprise, right? So is everything in my organization part of my system security plan because I may store, process, or transmit CUI anywhere in my organization? Or is it a fairly well-defined group of people, machines, etc., that use this? And so I can shrink that boundary a little bit and only maintain that in what's typically called an enclave. And so can I create an enclave for my CUI and restrict it only to those individuals who are part of that flow? Or do I consider the entire organization or enterprise as part of my overall system? And the thing to also think about is things like backup, disaster recovery, etc. People from IT who may have access to those systems and so have access to those files. So they may also be considered part of that data flow. They may have access to the controlled unclassified information. So think about those folks, make sure they're encompassed within that overall system security plan. Now, what you'll also want to build is a system diagram and or a network diagram. And in this, the assessment guide basically breaks out the different kinds of things into the categories that you see here, right? There are those places or those systems where you actually store, process, and transmit CUI, right? It may be on workstations, it may be on servers and storage, it may be physical file cabinets. Those things are your controlled unclassified information assets, right? So those things should be encompassed within this diagram. You may also have the security protection assets. These are things not necessarily where the CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted, but they may protect it. So for example, firewalls, right? You may have firewall systems that segregate your network into various virtual local area networks. You may have a physical file cabinet with a lock, right? Those kinds of things are security protection assets. You may have some CCTVs that monitor your physical spaces, things like that. All of those things can be considered security protection assets. Now, you may also have agreements with various external service providers or managed service providers or managed security system providers, MSPs, MSSPs, etc., that are doing a portion of your organization's IT functions. Those things are sometimes the contractor risk managed assets. They're people or these are systems that may have access to your systems to do some things. So you need to account for those, mark them, etc. You may have things that are out of scope. You may have some specialized assets, CNC machines, CAD systems, etc., that don't necessarily manipulate the information or the information isn't stored there, but it may be on there periodically. You may have some additional controls around that kind of system, etc. So just account for all those things. Make that part of your network diagram and your system security plan, because that's what's going to determine what those third-party assessors are going to look at when they do that third-party assessment. You define that assessment scope, and then they come and do the assessment based on that scope that you provide to them. Now, NIST 800-171, and we're going to talk about R2, right? That's revision 2 of NIST 800-171. There is an R3 out there. It's available today. However, the Department of Defense specifically states that CMMC is going to be against NIST 800-171 R2. So just take a look at that. That is 110 controls across 14 families or categories. They're not evenly distributed. Some have a few more, some have a few less, but it's 14 control categories with 110 controls in there. Now, within each of these controls, there are assessment objectives. So when the assessors come in to do their assessment, they're going to take a look to determine if you do these things. And they're going to require that you do these things against that particular control. So when you're doing your self-assessment, you should take a look at these determine if statements. This screenshot that you see here is taken from that assessment guide, that NIST 800-171 alpha. And so these are the things you're going to want to consider when you look at a control and you determine whether or not you've actually implemented that control. What you'll also want to gather as part of that system security plan, because this is what the assessors are going to ask for, they're going to ask for either screenshots or you to demonstrate how you do that particular thing, whether or not you have evidence to support that you've done that. So for example, if you use something like Microsoft's Entra to create groups, to restrict access to certain systems, certain files, etc., they're going to want to see, your entries that define those different groups. They're also going to ask to, talk to the staff that you have that's doing that and make sure they know how to do it in accordance with, your policies and procedures and how to do that. They're also going to check to see if you review these things periodically to make sure you're still in accordance with them, or whether or not, maybe your technology's changed or something else you've done has changed over time. Maybe you've changed something, maybe the technology underneath you has changed something, but are you periodically testing and reviewing those controls to make sure they're still valid? So when you look at a control and you do your self-assessment, make sure you have all of these things accounted for before you really mark that control as implemented, because that's what the assessors are going to ask for when they come on site to assess you and your organization. Now, as I mentioned, right, each of these different controls has a point value, 1, 3, or 5. That's why your score is going to range from a negative number to the 110. Now, when we talk about POAMs, that's a plan of action and milestones. As you do your assessment, the way it's typically done is if you haven't got a control in place, you should open a POAM against it. And that POAM is that plan of action you have to address that item that's not currently completed. What's your plan of action to do that? What date do you have that expected to be done? Now, if an assessor comes on site and is doing your assessment and they find that you haven't fully implemented a particular control, they're going to either do one of two things. They're either going to stop the assessment because that control isn't allowed not to be completed yet. That's usually those 3 or 5 point controls and some of those 1 point controls. However, if it is one of those 1 point controls that is allowable not to be completed, if you will, or not to be implemented, they're going to continue their assessment, and you'll then have 180 days to close that particular item. You would then go back to that assessment organization and determine, and then they would come in, reassess that control, and then they would give you your assessment. However, if you're doing a self-assessment today to determine whether or not you're ready for that third-party assessment, it's still a good idea to use that POAM methodology to say, okay, look, we've done our self-assessment. We have a score of 30. So we have a number of different controls of all values that are not done. Let's open POAMs against them. Let's work on, those of high value first, most complicated, or maybe we see all the 1.1s are easy. Let's knock those out and then continue. So it's kind of that allows you to kind of determine what's easier for you to knock off, what's going to give you the most, the most money or the most benefit for what you invest in it, etc. But understand you need to have these all closed before you start to engage with that third-party assessor. Now, these are the point values taken from that NIST 800-171 alpha. Those are the 5 point controls and the 3 point controls. You'll be getting this deck as I mentioned, so this link will take you to that assessment guide and allow you to score those. Now, what I'll show you as I go through the certification assistant demonstration is that certification assistant will go ahead and score this for you. And you'll get that score as part of your overall dashboard. Now, these are 1-point controls that are still considered critical enough by the Department of Defense to say, well, even if you have these 1-point controls, these can have POAMs against them. So they still need to be considered fully implemented before you can pass an assessment. As I mentioned, if you do get a POAM opened against one of those 1-point controls that is allowed, you'll have 180 days to close that. You would then reach back to that same organization that did your assessment initially. They'll then come evaluate whether or not you've implemented that control, and that's when they'll go ahead and finish your assessment, give you the checkbox. They then go into the EMAS system and update your assessment. And that has to happen once every 3 years as that third-party assessment. You'll still need to annually affirm that you do those things, that you're still in compliance with it, and that'll have to be done by an officer of your company. So hopefully that gives everybody a pretty good idea on what the overall assessment process is. Now, as I mentioned, Exostar has a solution called Certification Assistant. Certification Assistant will walk you through that assessment process. It will allow you to centralize all that information about the system and generate that system security plan. It allows you to gather all that evidence in one location into Certification Assistant itself, link it to those different controls, and so when you're ready to engage with that third party, you have basically a printout of your system security plan. You have an evidence list, an Excel spreadsheet, etc. So you can share that with the assessors before they come on site. So let me show you how that actually works. So this is Exostar Certification Assistant, and I've got an assessment open, right? I called it our Certification Assistant template. Now, you'll need a separate assessment done for every cage code your organization has. So if your company, is just your company and you have one location and it has all the same security, if you will, around this particular system, then you would only need one assessment done. If you've got multiple locations with different procedures and different cage codes, etc., you then may have to do multiple system security plans. So in this case, we're a single entity company, got one location. And when you come into Certification Assistant initially, this will obviously be blank. And you would then start to fill out the information. You'd first start to fill out the information about your organization, right? This is, your company's name, its address, where is it located, all those kinds of things. Who are the people involved in the assessment? Who's responsible for it, right? So we have here, I've completed this for Exostar. This is our address. This is the person who owns the overall system security plan, but we also have a point of contact, myself. This we start to fill out to help us identify who to ask questions of, if we have questions, who to go to, etc. We then start to define the overall system, right? As I mentioned before, typically systems are either considered an enterprise, where you're taking a look at the entire organization because you really can't cleanly separate out the systems and people who are responsible for just controlled unclassified information. So if you have that, or if you have an enclave, and Exostar has an enclave solution as well. So we're going to define that. We're going to create that network diagram, that system diagram and boundary. We may also upload our data flow diagram to help us define that overall system. Leverage systems are those things that you may be utilizing as part of those system security assets. Like for example, I've got, Exostar's Enclave is our managed Microsoft 365. So that's a system we're leveraging. We're leveraging the customer or the customer responsibility matrix. So Exostar is doing 85 of the 110 controls within the Enclave. We also have some other systems we're using as an organization like Intune to manage our endpoints and things like that. So this helps you determine those other systems that are additive to your own company systems. We then start to go into each of the individual practices. And obviously those individual practices are those categories and each of the individual controls within those. Now, this is the one I had open last, right? 3.2.3 about awareness and training, in particular, insider threat awareness. Now, you can get to these individual practices a few different ways, right? It goes back to the last one you had open, or you can go to it obviously from your dashboard. Now, the dashboard is providing me feedback in real time as I go through this self-assessment. So as you see, it's how am I doing against each of the individual practices in those different groups, those different tasks, right? This is the organization task, the system info task, and how I'm filling out this information. I've got some POAMs open because not all my individual practices are completed. It's keeping track of that score for the SPRS system, right? We're currently at a 32. As I said, I've got some POAMs open. So in one of those POAMs is that practice 3.2.3 that I was working on that isn't yet implemented. Right? This one right here against awareness and training. So if I want to then, go into that practice and start to, close it or implement it, I'm going to want to put in the information that says, okay, how do we do awareness and training, particularly around insider threat awareness? So we're going to create our policies and procedures, our implementation statement, if you will. And I've written that up here in Word, right? We're going to provide that security and awareness training, in particular, our insider threat training. This is how we implement it. And we also have a shared responsibility from our MSP and our solution provider of where we're storing and processing information as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut and paste this information as my implementation statement of how we do this. So let me take that and let me put that into my implementation statement. And, it's now there. I've got the evidence of us doing that, and I can upload that as well. So I could upload those rosters from HR as the evidence that we've actually performed the training. We could also do that as part of that review process. And then once I've done this, I can move this from not implemented to implemented. I'm going to upload that evidence. So I'm going to go into my file. And in this case, I'm just going to use that file I just used. And I'm going to drop that file in there as the evidence of our, of what we've done. Now, this in real life, this evidence would actually be to either our LMS, who's keeping track of the training we're doing, or if this is more of a manual process where we have a roster of who attended the training, things like that. That's going to be the evidence that we've done this, that we've actually done the training itself. We've then marked this as implemented, And now if I go to the dashboard, you'll see that hopefully my score has changed, right? We were at 32 before. I believe this is a 1 point. So we'd now be at 33. Yep. And it's improved our SPRS score by that 1 because now we've completed that particular practice, or we've implemented that particular practice that wasn't there before. I could then also mark that POAM as closed. And then as I go through the other controls, for this one, for example, in 3.1.5, if we haven't implemented a particular control for this, I'm going to move this from not implemented to not implemented, and then I could create a POAM against this to go ahead and start to work on this particular control. I'm going to want to assign this to somebody, right? Because I don't want anything not to have a particular assignment. And then we're going to obviously start to work to get this particular control. When do we want it done by? This date's already passed, so I don't want it done by then. It's going to have to be done by Halloween. And not started yet, but we've just assigned it out, so now it's in progress. And as I mentioned before, we can start to track this to closure. And now overall, as this is put into the dashboard, as it's fed to the organization, we can keep track of it. But the other, if you will, important thing is that now when we engage with that third party, I have all the information about my different policies, procedures, practices, etc. here in one location. I've got the evidence for those available for those assessors when they come on site. And I've got the documentation also that I can share with them. So I can print out that SSP. I can print out that evidence list, and I can share that with the assessors, because as you'll understand, when you go to those assessors, one of the steps is that information gathering that they'll do with you. Well, where they'll ask you for your SSP, your evidence list, etc. So before they come on site, they have an idea of what that overall system looks like, what they're going to be evaluating, who they're going to be talking to, etc. So Certification Assistant allows you to manage and run that overall CMMC program, because this isn't really simply about completing a checkbox. It is about managing an overall cybersecurity program within and across your organization to satisfy those contractual requirements that you have. So hopefully that kind of showed you how you can use a tool to help you manage that overall assessment process. We want to centralize and manage that overall CMMC program. We want to ensure that we have all of the evidence gathered in one place. We've got that system defined and outlined, available to those assessors when they come on site, so they know what they're going to see, how they're going to see it, and what they're going to do. Now, this is part of Exostar's CMMC Ready Suite. This is a solution of SaaS applications that allow you to, in Certification Assistance case, to manage that CMMC program. It includes a companion application called Policy Pro, which is an application that allows you to get templates for each of the 14 control families, then edit those templates to meet your particular organization's methods and how you've implemented that particular control. It then has an AI engine that allows you to run that policy that you've written based on that template through that AI engine and get a score on how that how that effectively addresses that particular control. It gives you feedback based on what are called key elements not included. That's based on things like keyword and word search and relation to the actual policy itself. to determine whether or not you need additional things in there, and it'll give you that feedback as part of it. Now, if you've got policies that you've written for other compliance requirements like ISO or HIPAA or anything like that, you can take those policies and run them through Policy Pro as well. They'll also give you those key elements, not included, but with those things that are kind of focused on CMMC. So it allows you to customize those ones that you may have written for others and then get some feedback on those as well. Now, if you're looking for an enclave to store, process, or transmit CUI up in Microsoft's Azure GCC High, that's our managed Microsoft 365 solution. This is based on Microsoft Teams with an Exostar application embedded within it that satisfies 85 of those 110 controls there within the enclave, provides you that environment to store, process, and transmit controlled unclassified information that you may receive, gate access to it, only give access to those folks in your organization or outside as well that are part of your overall CUI data flow. We then have a number of partners who are either C3PAOs or RPOs, really to help you achieve that overall and get ready for that CMMC assessment. These folks know the Exostar tools and often utilize that to help you get ready or to help you complete that overall CMMC assessment. And then you may engage with one of our other partners to actually do the overall, the CMMC assessment itself. Those would be those C3POs that are part of the Exostar network as well. So no matter where you are in your CMMC journey, Exostar can assist you along that way. So as I mentioned, we did get a few questions in prior to today's session, so I'm going to go ahead and answer those. So number one, it is hard for non-technical small businesses to get motivated to become compliant. It's also tough to figure out the actual quote for how much this is going to cost. Any suggestions on doing that? So I didn't know if this was a statement or a question, but I put it in anyway, because really the motivation will be to continue to do business in the Department of Defense. This is going to be a contractual requirement to be compliant with CMMC. Now, you may only choose to bid on level 1 contracts. So you don't need that third-party assessment, and you only need to meet those 15 requirements to secure FCI. Absolutely valid, right? And that is a large portion of the DoD business. So you may restrict yourself to that. But if you do want to be on those contracts that require controlled unclassified information to be shared with you, then you are going to need that third-party assessment, and you are going to need to be, to meet those requirements. Will there continue to be a requirement to submit SPRS scores for our sites with cage codes? As far as I know, the 7019 clause will remain, so it still will become part of that requirement. Now, this may go away because the assumption would be that you're going to have to be at 110, so this may become a redundant requirement and it may be removed. I just don't know enough on whether or not that clause is going to be removed. So number 2, is self-assessment same as gap assessment? Also, do you need to hire a certified practitioner to create this baseline? So what I typically see is self-assessments are those things done by your organization. So this is you taking a look at your current system, scoring yourself, and that is your self-assessment. Gap assessments are typically done by third parties. So that's really the major difference. So when you engage with a third party to come out and and ask them to do an assessment of your readiness for CMMC, that's typically what's called a gap assessment. You may also see folks now coming out or you may see MSPs out there that are advertising mock assessments. That's them coming in as an assessor themselves and determining whether or not, everything you did or gathered for part of your self-assessment where you thought you were ready, and whether or not that is, valid, and are you really ready to have those assessors come on site. Now, if you're looking to do a gap assessment, I would look to hire somebody who's designated as an RPO, a registered practitioner organization. Those folks can be found on the CyberAB's website. So you'd want to go there, look for one in your area, one or in your industry, somebody who has experience in your industry and obviously is a registered practitioner. That means they've gone through the CMMC training. So number 3, how to secure physical CUI in daily use on the production floor and enforce secure document storage for retention purposes. Now, this is going to vary based on obviously your location, the type of facility you have, etc. But the physical security of CUI is one of those controls in NIST 800-171. And it talks about everything from securing access to your facilities, making sure you have those visitor logs, make sure you're assigning visitor passes and things like that. You're keeping, if you will, logs of entry and exits from people that are going into these different areas of your building. It does include possible things like CCTV around your organization. What kind of, do you have places that are marked for controlled unclassified information, including file cabinets and things like that for the secure storage of those? So you will want to mark places in your facility that are utilized for, working with controlled unclassified information. You will want to mark those file cabinets and secure those file cabinets where you may be storing that controlled unclassified information or other storage devices. Then finally, number 4, even though Microsoft GCCI seems impenetrable and helps to stay compliant, can a company use GCCI as the only source of data backup without the risk of single point of failure? So the answer there is yes. So Microsoft's GCCI itself has a number of backup services that are not single point of failure services. They typically do have off-site backup or backup to another location. So GCCI itself isn't just one data center. It is physically separated data centers where Microsoft is hosting the GCCI environment. It's also, got redundant staff and things like that meet those ITAR requirements that are monitoring and, and safeguarding that particular infrastructure for those. And they are physically and logically separated as well to provide that, there no single point of failure in those particular environments. So it can be set up that way. It really just depends on which of those Microsoft services you're utilizing, how you set up that, your environment, and the Microsoft services that you utilize to protect that environment. So I think that was the only question. Those were the only questions I received prior to today's session. When you get this deck, you'll also see some useful sources of information. So please utilize this as necessary. As I mentioned, if you have questions, please reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. You can email us that at any time. Also, you can come to our website, www.exostar.com, submit the form there as well to ask us any questions, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Well, thanks so much for your time and your attention today. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this was able to answer everybody's questions. And we'll get back to you as soon as we can with those questions if you submit them as mentioned. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thanks so much.